We're just kind of doing an overview of the Psalms and how to read them. And so there's two parts to that, at least. One is just how do we read the literature, the words on the page? How do we process that? And then the other part is what are we doing with it inside? So as I was thinking about just really broad purposes, I was thinking that the Psalms are really written for a couple of reasons. And I guess I'm going to go back and forth from screen sharing because I think it's boring just to look at somebody's slides, but every now and then I'm going to put them up. How now? Let's see. Here we go. So the Psalms are written to talk to God about life and to talk about God into life. So what are we saying about that? So on the one hand, the Psalms bring us from a great variety of situations in life, people coming to God and talking to them honestly, whether it's about how crappy life is or about how wonderful life is. It's people showing up, talking to God about whatever's going on in their life and establishing that connection and relationship with God. On the other hand, these are, songs that are performed in corporate worship. They're not just prayers. And they have a way of talking about life, talking about God to speak into the lives of everybody in the community. Sometimes it's a testimony after we've lamented about how crappy life is. We have a testimony about how God intervened and helped us. And then we speak that into the community so that they encounter God in a deeper and richer way as a result of kind of stepping into our situation and our encounter with God. Whoops. Maybe I'm going to get tired of switching from screen share to not screen share. In turn, what do we do with that? I kind of summarized it this way. We want to meet with God being honest, open, and humble, regardless of our life situation, because he really is the answer. There's so many things that we have any kind of problem with, and we try and diagnose it, and we often think, well, the answer is for me to work harder. Is for me to work better, for me to do something to solve this. Maybe it's in, our relationships, whether it's parenting, whether it's marriage, whether it's coworkers. And we always run out of whatever strength we have in us because it's never really sufficient for everything. And there's something that's much deeper, more stable, much stronger from just encountering God and knowing him, and then trying to let his strength flow through us into whatever the situation is. So I think that's, at least that's how I look at Psalms. They're doing multiple jobs at once. It's not like we come to one psalm and that psalm is only a talk about God into life psalm, or another psalm is only a talk about life to God psalm, but they're doing both. And the big picture, I think, is that we all want to be able to meet with God in a way that's really rich as we work through this material. There's a couple stresses, and then I'm going to go to discussion in a second, but just kind of walk through the variety of things that are in the Psalms, right? The Psalms, the Psalter presents scenes of rejoicing, despair, confident hope, uncertainty, and solemn moments of profound musings. And we try and enter those scenes as they resonate with our own lives and experiences. And so we want to just kind of sit with the psalmists, these poets, and let their words become ours. But when we're in the Old Testament, in a lot of places, we can feel like, we're just visitors. The places are unfamiliar. They talk about countries that don't exist anymore. They talk about weapons that nobody uses, political systems that don't exist. They had different social institutions. I say antiquated religion because I'm thinking of things like how many of us have cut a sheep's throat in order to burn it on an altar lately? And then we're in the Psalms and we read this poetry and it doesn't rhyme. It doesn't have any meter in English. And usually on the page, it looks goofy, right? Because there's a lot of indentation going on. They put, Bibles have text in 2 different columns, and that makes it really narrow. And so when they indent a line for the poetry and then it line wraps, then it comes out weird on the other side. For a visual oriented learner like me, it just, to me, it's a mess. It drives me nuts. And so that's what we're looking at. And we're really drawn by the content in the Psalms. We kind of resonate with these expressions of pain or grief or rejoicing, but sometimes it just has this really foreign ring to it. And so that kind of sometimes gets in our way, since we're trying to visit with these psalmists, but they're coming from this different culture. We're trying to reflect honestly within ourselves and find how these psalms can help us speak to God. And so sometimes there just seems like there's some barriers to that. So I thought this would be a good place just to stop and say, just, where are you? When you look at the Psalms, what is it that you most feel like you wish you had as a tool, or what do you find most helpful, or even what do you find most of as a hindrance?
I think sometimes just understanding the situation the psalmist is in and why they're writing what they're writing. I think a lot of the times we know some of the ones that David wrote, and like he just committed adultery and all of that. So those are some of those we know the history behind it, but other ones you read it and you're, I think at least for me, sometimes I wonder like how did they get to the point of writing what they're writing?
Yeah, good. Anyone else? Hi, Donna. Oh, Diana. I do that, don't I? Every other time I call you the wrong name.
No problem. Hello, good to see you.
Yeah. Well, let me comment on that, Claire. It is like what you alluded to Psalm 51. David's committed adultery, and he's talking about the process of repenting and where he comes out on the other side. And to correlate some of those Psalms with a place in the book of Samuel really helps us get a hold of what David was doing there. On the other hand, is there any benefit to not knowing where the Psalms came from? And perhaps sometimes there is, because these are Psalms that, they're meant to be recycled. So do I have to have committed adultery in order to enter into the kind of repentance that David is talking about in Psalm 51? And a lot of the Psalms, when they talk about my sin, they often don't say what sin it was specifically, but they portray the sin as the obstacle it was in their relationships and the consequences it had, and then the attitude of my heart about that sin. And because it's general, that allows any of us who are in a similar kind of situation to pick that psalm up and use it. I think we still often wish we had more backstory, just like you're saying. But the book of Psalms is like their hymn book, and they wanted to be able to use them on multiple occasions. The same thing though with using these Psalms for holidays. they knew what their custom was. On such and such a holiday, they're going to use these songs, and that would enrich it. And we lose a little bit there. So I feel that tension with you, but maybe there's a gain at the same time that we have that struggle. Anyone else before we move on?
One of the things I always thought, I know it's probably impossible for us, but I know these were all songs that they sung. And for us, we don't have the actual music it went to, but I think it would just be so cool one day if we could actually know like how they sounded, seeing it out loud and things like that. And then you also mentioned, because it is poetry in a different language, like we went through a video series on Psalms 119, and we know that it's basically every stanza is an acrostic of a Hebrew letter. And I know we missed that in English, but it would be really cool. Obviously, we're proficient enough in Hebrew to hear that and see the rhythm that goes within the poetry that's there. So I think the content is always very theological when we get it, but you still miss some of the beauty sometimes. And I think that's just the process of translation.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of beauty that we miss. Hopefully we'll do an exercise with Psalm 6 later, and we'll be able to see how we can capture a little bit of that beauty. We also miss, word plays that are based on sound. But yeah, and sometimes I think we come to the Bible expecting it to be a theology book and not expecting it to be beautiful. And we maybe don't even know where in our hearts to put that beauty component. So, yeah, good comment. Okay, let's move forward a little bit. I'm going to talk with you a bit about the just the nature of the Psalms as literature. So a psalm is in at least 3, if not 4 categories as a piece of literature. They're prayers, they're songs. Many of them were used in worship ceremonies. I don't know if we can say that they all were, but many were. And then they've been collected into a book. And so just thinking about those uses, we can reflect on a few things. So the Psalms, whether they're acting as prayers or songs, they might be a psalm for the individual. A psalm will have a lot of I as the speaker, or they might be for the community where they have a lot of we as the speaker. And, when, like, I understand, you're not able to go to church and sing together yet, right? About a month ago, we started being able to go to church again with, every third row occupied and kind of spread out. And we weren't singing yet. And then then 2 or 3 weeks ago, we could sing out loud. And, today we're down to every other row seating. And so we have more people that can fit in, and we could all sing. And there's this feeling of corporate solidarity, when you get to sing together. And then at the same time, the Psalms are giving us focus. So they're giving the community a focus. Of course, the focus is on God. And as prayers, like having a prayer book, they're training us in how to talk to God. And even when it's not, I'm going to take this psalm and I'm going to try and pray it as a prayer, even when it's not that word for word becoming our words, they're showing us how to talk to God. They're showing us things like we're really allowed to complain to God. God is big enough to have room for us to walk into the throne room and have complaints. And we need to be humble, but we can come in and complain. I mean, I grew up in a household where complaining wasn't exactly smiled upon and received well. So we didn't complain. We just learned to take everything and shove it under the rug and pretend like there's no problem. But God shows us a model that don't pretend that there's no problem. Show up with the problem. Talk about the problem. cry about the problem, stomp your feet about the problem. And then when you've let it all sit, let it all out, sit there and let's talk, right? Meet with me. As ceremonies, for the ancient Israel, that put all of these psalms into 3 dimensions, right? When you have to travel to Jerusalem for one of the festivals, and you go in a company, and I think it's Psalm 120 to 134, the Psalms of Ascents that are often understood to be as you approach Jerusalem for these festivals. And you sing these as your group. You show up in Jerusalem. There's a couple of different psalms that have to do with the community coming up to the gates, and there's a Q&A between the gatekeepers and the crowd. Who may come and worship before the Lord? Well, the person who has these characteristics. And we kind of lose that 3-dimensional multi-voice aspect of the Psalms when we just see them in a book. So we sort of want to get trained to see where we have different speaking voices, when the psalmist is speaking, when a priest or a prophet is speaking to the psalmist, when God is speaking, and be able to enhance our experience more just by seeing those different active parts that are there. And then it is also a book, and it's a book designed for meditation. I mean, Psalm 1 is the first psalm because it's deliberately placed there, and it talks about meditating on God's instruction, and it kind of invites us to view all of the Psalms as a place to come and yes, I've prayed it. Yes, I've sung it. Yes, I've been to the ceremony, but there's still more depths for me to plumb in meditating on what this is teaching, what it's calling my heart to do, and how to relate to God. One of the things that we run into, didn't know if I heard a question there. One of the things we run into when we are in the Psalms are those headings, right? So we get a heading that maybe says, by David, a miktam to the tune of Al Alamot, or something like that. And not all of that is clear. So I'll just give you some smatterings of information before we go to the next piece. I say authors or patrons because you know how we can use the same word to have the different meanings. Like if I say the book of David, is that the book about David? Is that the book written by David? Or is that the book that David owns? David's book. And when the people's names show up in these headings, the word there could mean that it's written by them. So it could be by David, but the same word could mean for David. It was written for David, or even just about the Davidic line. And, that can maybe sometimes give us a different nuance on it. Are we looking for an experience in David's life to put that psalm into? Or is this simply a psalm that David had commissioned and has been written for him and for the royal line, or something like that? The genres that are mentioned in the headings, they really are opaque to us. I'm sorry, I wish I could bring more light to that. And the translations, your English translations may leave the Hebrew there, or it might translate them. So it might say this is a shir, or a miktam, or a mizmor, or something like that. Or they might try and translate them. So a shir is a song. A mizmor, maybe they call it a hymn or a melody or something. A miktam, a skilled playing, or it's for the choir director. And it tells us a few tune names, maybe, and we don't know any of those tunes. But we can tell that they were viewing these as, things that they needed instruction to sing or to perform, and that they had different classifications for them. And they at least had people who had commissioned them or who had authored them. And that was part of bringing them into collections. So when we look at like the Psalms as a book is actually 5 books. And in book 1, which is Psalm 1 through 41, David's the only author that gets mentioned. And then in book 2, we get some more. We have Psalms of Asaph and the sons of Korah, and we get some more of those in book 3. But there are different ways that they put their collections together. And, you know, we have the option of saying, okay, I want to study all of the Psalms of Asaph, or I want to study all of the Psalms of the sons of Korah, because I think they'll be talking about the same kinds of themes in the same way. And because they're doing that, that'll, there's just more continuity between them. And it's a different type of exercise that I can go through in processing the Psalms. When we think of genres though, I've got 2 slides here on the genres. These are the things that we think of. A lot of the Psalms are hymns, right? They have a positive praise element. So we have hymns of praise where we're mostly talking about what God has accomplished or what he is like. Hymns of thanksgiving where we're demonstrating gratitude to God for what he's done. Modern scholars sometimes try and keep those really distinct, and then it breaks down, and so we just say, well, it's a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. And all of those can be designed primarily as something to be said by an individual speaker or for the community. And then there's another set of hymns where there's this theme of the Lord's kingship. Maybe that's really a subcategory of hymns of praise. And Zion songs, certain hymns that refer to Jerusalem, and they use that as a theme and a picture for God's relationship and his presence with his people. And then there's those ones that are the most common in the book of Psalms, which are laments. We don't mean grieving over somebody who has died when we use the word lament here. We mean cries for help. Complaining about the yuckiness of life. And again, those are sometimes geared to be spoken by an individual, and sometimes they're corporate as the community goes through awfulness. A lot of laments have a section that is a section about confidence, and sometimes they just split that section off, as it were, and let it be the whole psalm. So Psalm 23 is a good example. It's a psalm of confidence. But when studied against like an ancient Near Eastern background of themes, if you look at Psalm 22 and 23 together, it's like there's a set of, I can't remember, 7 or 8 themes or whatever. And, you know, the first 5 or 6 are right there in Psalm 22, and the last couple are in Psalm 23. And kind of makes me wonder, were those one psalm originally, and then they split off the most uplifting part for separate use on occasion? And then we have songs that talk about the king of Israel, I mean the human king, psalms that are liturgical, and then some psalms that are give advice, right? They're wisdom psalms or instructional psalms. And, you know, when we come to a psalm, if we first familiarize ourselves, this is the kind of the broad scope of what this kind of psalm is trying to do, then that can give us a better orientation to that psalm as we then read and study it. So now I want to move into another form of the literary aspect, and that's just how does this poetry work? Because the form for Psalms doesn't look like any of our poetry, especially when it looks so messy on the page. Things don't rhyme. There's no discernible meter. There's meter in the Hebrew, but to try and get that over into English is really, really difficult. And there's odd word pictures. I mean, how many of us are lifting up our horns, right? Or things like that are mentioned in the Psalms. And, you know, what do we do with those odd word pictures? What we do have in Hebrew poetry are lines with parallelism. So in the original Hebrew, there's they're short lines. They usually have 3 or 4 beats. In other words, however many words there are, there's 3 or 4 accented syllables in that set, and that provides a certain symmetry to how the poems work. And then the meaning of often 2 lines are paired together, and they're saying essentially the same idea. They might say it in the same way or by using its opposite, like 2 sides of a coin, or it might complete it. So there is this structural thing that drives the lines of the poetry themselves. And then the lines are collected into stanzas. And it's not like we're used to with our hymnal, right? Where we've got verses and then there's a chorus that we repeat every time, and then they'll go on to stanza 2 or whatever. It's more like sections of the poem. And there's often a structure to those, and it's usually quite beautiful, and it's usually not apparent in our English translations at all. It's just completely obscured. And the last 2 things we will talk about, well, actually, we already talked about genres. Speech functions we're going to talk about a little bit later. We're going to look at this idea of the line structure. So here's some examples. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So you can see pretty easily that heavens and skies are same idea. Declare and proclaim are same idea. The glory of God and the work of his hands, same idea. So that's where 2 lines are saying in general the same idea, but not quite the same way. And not just to, okay, I've got to get out my thesaurus and say it another way. It's often adding a new kind of thing. And then we have this antithetic parallelism. So here's our horns. I will cut off the horns of the wicked, but the horns of the righteous will be lifted up. So the 2 opposites that are related, because the word picture is that the enemy, the wicked, are going to be defeated. They're not going to be able to, hold up their horn and, sound triumph. They will be cut off. They will be stopped. That will not happen. The horns of the righteous will be lifted up. They will be able to lift up their horn and blow the victory cry. And so even though it's saying it in opposite ways, it's still driving at the same idea. Sometimes, however, the second line just completes the sentence. So Psalm 119:11, I've hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. So the second line is not a restatement in any way. It's not similar, it's not opposite, it just completes the idea of the first line. But as we read through the Psalms, we can collect the lines together based on that parallelism and dealing with the same topic. And that will help us to determine stanzas. I'm going to come back to that. So in Psalm 6, let's see. If you have, I'm going to switch to screen sharing, but a different screen. If you have your Psalm 6, and I'll leave this on screen, I'm invite you to take a few minutes. I encourage you to ignore all the verse numbers and just try and collect the signs, collect the lines that belong together just based on, is there a repetition of thought and word? And so it's usually going to be sets of 1, 2, or 3. It will be for this psalm. It'll all be 1, 2, or 3. Sometimes a psalm will have, 4 lines or 5 or 6, but even when that happens, I really think, like, if you had a set of 4, you should read it as 2 sets of 2, or if you had a set of 5, a set of 2 and a set of 3. All right, so that's your task. We're going to take a few minutes, read through the psalm, try and decide which lines should be grouped together into little sets. and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it, okay? See how we did. So anyone, if we have to start at the beginning. How many lines belong in this group? 1, 2, or 3? And why?
2.
Okay, so somebody said 2, great. And why do they belong together? What's parallel?
Rebuke and discipline and anger and wrath.
Yeah, and me, and Lord is implied the second time. So that was pretty easy. Coming to verse 2, how many lines belong here? 1, 2, or 3?
3.
Okay, 3, and let's look at why, because it's not quite as apparent as it was with the first 2, right? Why do we have 3 lines that belong together here?
I just noticed a self-focused weakness, like his soul is in anguish. He needs healing and mercy.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the anguish piece, you have, for I am faint, for my bones are in agony, and you can understand the word for here, for my soul is in deep anguish. And all 3 of those, and if we were in a different English translation, we would find out that instead of saying in agony and in deep anguish, it would use the exact same word because it's the same word in Hebrew. Right, so here we have mercy on me and heal me, and we don't get a request like that at the beginning of this line, but it's understood, just like, oh Lord is understood applying to the next line here. So these 3 lines belong together just through their parallelism. How about this line? 1, 2, or 3 in this group?
1.
Yeah, just 1, right? It's a question. There's nothing parallel really. Well, the Lord's name is mentioned again, but it's on its own. Okay, here, are we going to have 1, 2, or 3?
2.
Yeah, we've got 2, and how come?
Requests for deliverance.
Yeah, deliver me and save me. Really good. What about here? 1, 2, or 3?
2.
2, right? Proclaims and praises, and among the dead and from the grave. Now, don't let the English verse numbers trick you here. Is this going to be 1, 2, or 3?
1.
1. And how come we're going to say 1 instead of 3?
Because I feel like the next 3 go together. Oh, because they talk about weeping, tears, and eyes of sorrow, but maybe I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Because you look here, you've got the bed and the couch, and you've got drenching with tears and, a flood of weeping. So they're all lines of lament. They're all lines of complaint, but there's no parallelism going on between this part of verse 6 and these parts. And then, so at verse 7, is that going to be 1, 2, or 3?
2.
Yeah, it's going to be 2. And how come?
Like eyes wake wake and sorrow falls.
Right. So when we say my eyes here, the they in the next line is my eyes again, and the growing weak and the failing are the same. And this is where the psalmist is, expanding, because on the one hand, there's sorrow, that's the reason, but the B line lets you know the reason behind the sorrow is all my foes. So good. And then what about at 8? And this is going to be a case where you need to look ahead again. Will this be 1, 2, or 3?
1.
Yeah, that would be 1, because this is a set of 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's heard or accepted my weeping or my cry or my prayer. And those are all tightly connected. And that leaves us with only 2 at the end. So let's see, I got to switch which I'm sharing. When we're in Psalm 6, so to see kind of the beauty in what's going on, we've got 2 and then 3 plus this 1 line. And then we've got 2 sets of 2, a single line, 2 sets of 2 again. And then we've got another structure of 1 followed by 3, because this set of 3 is connected to this 8a line because all 3 of these things are the reason why they should turn away. And then we've got 2 at the end. If we just backed up and looked at that, we've got this 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 2 structure. That's the line structure, and it's completely mirrored. And you know, if we wrote that out, even if I just wrote it in Hebrew, and you couldn't read the words, but if I put spaces in between the stanzas, you would see a certain beauty just to the arrangement of it, which generally is completely lost to us when we're reading these in English. But when we've done something like this and noticed where the stanzas really are, and I encourage you here to not trust the verse numbers at all, and to not trust the paragraph breaks in your English translations at all either. All right, do the work yourself. I'm not sure who's responsible for the different translations, spaces, you know, paragraph marks in the Psalter, but yeah, just do it on your own and maybe trust yourself. But when we've done that, we can then come back and look at the kinds of things that are said in the Psalms. I got to check time here. I'm not going to work through this whole list, but this is a lament. These are the kinds of things that are common in a lament. There's often an initial appeal for God to listen. There's somewhere in there an account of the adversity that we're going through, and it might be accusations against the bad guys, or it might be complaining against God directly. Yeah, we can do that. Or it might be lamenting over, you know, personal distress that we're experiencing. And then there's often a petition, you know, save me, rescue me, some kind of statement of confidence. You know, I know that God will, even though I haven't seen it yet. I'm living in this tension. And often, but not always, there's a vow to praise God once he delivers. So when we know what to look for in the kind of psalm, you know, then we can look at the stanzas of the psalm and work on getting the flow of the emotion, because we want to look at both the flow of the emotion and the flow of thought. And it's, I think I would suggest taking that stanza by stanza, not line by line or verse by verse, but working on what is this stanza trying to do? What's it trying to say? How's it trying to help me express what I feel? So here we would have our initial appeal and petition. You know, the psalmist here appears to be concerned that the sins that they've committed are quite worthy of rebuke and punishment, and is begging for mercy, right? In other psalms, the psalmist will say, Lord, I'm innocent of this particular matter. Life is really unfair. So there's times when the psalm gives us words for when we're at fault, and sometimes it gives us words for when we're not at fault. We have to be very careful how we search our hearts to know which one of those to claim. Because, you know, the Psalms also say, oh, Lord, please inspect me, examine me, look at my intentions and judge me accordingly. And we don't usually like to ask for that. So, you know, so he's asking for mercy instead of wrath, you know, for graciousness instead of wrath, and just sets out there his hardship, you know, sort of like the Israelites in the wilderness. Yeah, we sinned, but it hurts now, right? And so that's how the psalmist is coming. And then we move to petition that has motivation. All right, so he's asking for rescue, not because of anything of my own worth, but because of your loyal love, and because this will bring you praise. And then we've got this, the center line of the whole poem is just releasing this emotion that I am just worn out. I am at the end. And the Lord's probably thinking, well, good, finally you're desperate enough to actually depend on me. And then he describes it further with this description of his grief. And you know, right now I'm sort of, you know, I'm marching through it intellectually, and I'm not doing a good job with the emotion part. And we will need to invest in that sometimes privately. When we're in a position in life where we have a hard time not breaking down in tears over something that's going on, then we resonate with these words really well. When life is going pretty well, we think we've got it all together, they may seem a little bit more distant. But by virtue of these being in the Psalter as a hymn book, it requires us to remember those moments of weakness and humility before God, even when things are going well, so that we don't get too overconfident. But then the psalm does end with this confidence section where he rebukes the enemies, is confident that God has heard him, and is confident that the shame is not going to be on him. The shame is going to be on those who are enemies. And the enemies in the Psalms are not just, it's not, you know, the person who cut me off in traffic. They're also always the enemies of God. We need to be very careful about who we call an enemy when we're in the Psalms. So there's a certain beauty there. Time, okay, we're still 5 minutes. There's a certain beauty in the Psalm, plus it's a tool for us to work with the Psalms, to see where the stanzas are, and just say, this is my approach. I'm going to find the stanzas. I'm going to look for that main thought. I'm going to look for that main emotion. And I want to have empathy with the psalmist. And I can do that by drawing on my own experiences. And I want to meet God at the same time as the psalmist was trying to do. Okay, so let's just do open questions.
So, sorry, when you say lines, so you're just saying every, because you said, like, you know, sometimes the indentation is all weird. Like, how do you know what's a line?
Yeah, usually in your printed Bible, what we call the A line, the first line in the set, is out to the margin. And then the B line will be indented compared to that. The C line might be in line with B, or it might be indented. It depends on your printer. I mean, not your printer that you print pages with, but the publisher. And when it's when the line wraps, you know, because, like, let's say the A line is longer than they have space for, and so it wraps around to the next line. That's, to me, when it gets visually confusing. But if you know you're at the beginning of a sentence, you can sort of tell your A line and your B line apart by the indentation, except that they might have done it wrong, right? Because, like, if we did Psalm 6 correctly, then, you know, verse 2 and 3 are not divided correctly in terms of the verse number. And verse 6 isn't divided correctly in terms of the verse number. So that's a long way of saying, if you can tell you're at the beginning of a sentence, right, or the beginning of a clause, that's a line, and then you've got to decide, does it belong with a set of 1, 2, or 3?
I have a question because obviously we're all reading in English. Is there a benefit to using different translations that we have in English to help us understand better? And do you have any recommendations on what are the good ones and what are some that you're like really bad? I don't know.
That is a great question, and it hits on something that I meant to talk about and failed to do. So it's like with the word pictures. If you're reading the Psalm and it says, you know, the horns of the enemies will be cut off, but, you know, the righteous will lift their horns, And you wonder, are we supposed to think we're unicorns and have horns? Are we supposed, what are these horns, right? If you go to the Net Bible, the Net Bible will not sound very poetic, but they tried to take all those word pictures and put them into normal English. So the Net Bible in that verse will say something like, you know, the enemy will be defeated, but the righteous will be victorious. And it will show you what the word picture means. And so if you set the Net Bible alongside of your NIV or your ESV or something and let the two play off of each other, that can be really helpful. Another thing with the Net Bible is it has all those notes and it will help give you some clarity. So two quick illustrations. Psalm, maybe it's 42, 43. As the deer pants for water, right? And we know the song. I'm a horrible singer. I apologize in advance. So, as the deer panteth for the water, so my soul, right? And then I got off key really bad. So, but you know, it sounds like a lullaby. But what's going on in the psalm, right? Just like a desperately thirsty deer is panting for the water, you know, my life is in such disarray that I long for you, God, right? So or another one is Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. And maybe we know a song that has that still kind of melodic, be still and know that I am God kind of thing, right? But if you look in that, if you took time to find the stanza, the verse before that is, he makes wars cease to the end of the earth. And the picture is, it's like if the teacher went out of the room for a while and all the third graders erupted into pandemonium, or you sent your kids out to play and you went out and there's disaster and fighting or something like that, that the authority figure just I'm going to yell here. The authority figure just walked in the room and said, stop, desist, be still, right? It's not this meditative, you know, calm yourself and, you know, say om, you know, and it's not that kind of a be still, right? And how would you know in English? Well, again, if you set your more poetic NIV-ish translation next to your Net Bible, you could, you know, or get on the Net Bible online, you can mouse over that word be still and it will give you a better sense of what kind of still is being talked about.